he had to be there for the grand moment when the last shovelful would be dug and the river would be manipulated and start racing. Yeah,
Yes.
he was there.
What happened?
I'm certain of it. Nothing. Nothing happened. Not a trickle of water moved from one river to the other. Not a drop.
You heard that there. That is local historian and author Aaron Hellman talking about the exact moment when the father of South Bend, Alexis Coquillard, realized that his whole net worth was wiped away by a ditch that wouldn't hold water. More of that later, but first, thank you for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. My name is Matt Emery, and I'm a local history nerd. My main mission in this podcast, as well as other Round the Bend material, is to create engaging content that shares how intertwined the South Bend and Mishawaka area's past is to our present. I interview local leaders, business owners, and community members to help tell their stories, because their stories help tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. Before we get to the interview, I just have a few simple favors. One is to be sure that you hit the download, like, or subscribe button on whatever podcast app that you listen to us on. Another favor is to follow us on social media, at Round the Bend Pod or at Round the Bend 574 on Twitter, Round the Bend Now and Then on Facebook, and now on YouTube, where I'm starting to dabble in some visual content as well. I have a few new videos that include some cool historical pictures, maps, newspaper articles, and narration by yours truly. All of those links are in the show notes as well. My last favor is to please just pass on the good word about the content. Now, let's dive into another interview that helps tell the story of South Bend and Mishawaka. The first time I went to the historic South Bend City Cemetery off of West Colfax Street and walked around, I saw a bridge that looked completely out of place and literally crosses over nothing. It crosses no stream, creek, road, nothing. Just a very old stone arch bridge. I thought about how strange that was, but it's in an extremely old cemetery, so I figured there was some purpose to it. A while after my cemetery visit, the South Bend Tribune published an article that actually explained the reasoning behind that out-of-place bridge in the city cemetery. Turns out, it's just as old as the cemetery, built in the 1830s, and there were dozens more similar bridges built on a 4-mile stretch of land spanning from the St. Joe River near Memorial Hospital and Leaper Park, all the way to the far west side of South Bend near Sample and Mayflower intersection. You see, this bridge in the city cemetery and those other similar bridges that were tore down 150 plus years ago were built to serve a purpose. They were built to get people from one side of a waterway to the other. This waterway was to be called the Kankakee Mill Race. This mill race was meant to connect the St. Joseph River to the Kankakee River. The water from the mill race was meant to provide hydroelectric energy to the brand new city and surrounding areas. The Kankakee Mill Race was built by one of South Bend's founding fathers, the very respected businessman and trader, Alexis Coquillard. It was a surefire way for him and his many investors to harness the energy of the newly built waterway and sell it to industrial buildings and mills that would be built along the canal. The 4-mile canal was dug out and built in the late 1830s. It started near nowadays Memorial Hospital in Leaper Park, right near the current Marion Street and Riverside Street intersection, and the canal stretched 4 miles west towards the Kankakee River. And it was a big deal. Advertisements in the newspaper boasted about how much power the waterway would bring to the area. Some mills were even built alongside the yet-to-have-water Kankakee Mill Race. Now, you all might be wondering, what in the world am I talking about? There is no canal running from the St. Joe River to the west side of South Bend. You see, Alexis Coquillard laid it all on the line. $100,000 he had invested in the project. That is $3.5 million today. He had his workers dig out a 4-mile waterway, only to find out that he had invested all of that money to dig a ditch, because this ditch could never and would never hold water. In this episode, you'll learn all about what has become known as Coquillard's Folly. I meet once again with local historian and author Aaron Hellman in one of his recent local history books, Ride the Jackrabbit, and more of the people, places, and events that make Michiana the most fascinating place in the Midwest. He wrote a chapter called The Dry Ditch and South Bend's Bridge to Nowhere about Coquillard's Folly. We first talk about Alexis Coquillard himself, and then we dive into this wild story from South Bend's past. And before we get into the interview, I highly encourage anyone who is interested in our local history to check out his books. He's written a couple of them with stories from our local history. His first one, The Incomplete History of St. Joseph County, and the one I mentioned above, Ride the Jackrabbit, and more of the people, places, and events that make Michiana the most fascinating place in the Midwest. As I mentioned in the previous episode that he was on, his writing style is informative, engaging, and definitely has a sense of humor. He also has a new children's book coming out as well, On the Southernmost Bend, A Beginning History of South Bend. The trailer for that book shows some of the examples of the text and illustrations, and I must say it looks awesome. I put the link to his website in the show notes, so be sure to support Aaron and his books. Now, here is my interview with Aaron Hellman, and I hope that you learn all about that dry ditch and the bridge to nowhere. This is so intriguing. Your chapter is called The Dry Ditch and South Bend's Bridge to Nowhere. And it's just so intriguing to me because I had been to, how did it all work out? I'm a history nerd, so I'd go like you ride your bikes to places, I'll drive and get out and walk. And I've done the city cemetery so many times because it is so historic in there. I mean, so many names that you recognize from our city are buried there. Like, oh, that street's named after him. Oh, this building is named after him. But then there's this weird bridge in the middle of there that's literally a bridge over land. It's a bridge to nowhere.
Yeah.
I was kind of curious about that. But then a newspaper article came out a few years after I saw that, and it kind of blew my mind that, holy moly, they're going to build this Coquillard was going to build this big canal in the middle of our city, and that's remnants of it. And it's from 1830s. I mean, that is crazy long time ago. Before we get started, let's talk about Alexis Coquillard himself. And he meant a lot to South Bend, to say the least. We don't need to dive too deep into everything, but man, talk to me about who Alexis Coquillard was and why he meant so much to South Bend.
So first, I'll tell you why Alexis Coquillard meant so much to me.
Oh, let's go.
I went to Coquillard Elementary School.
Nice. Yes.
And I just thought my school had a cool name. I thought Coquillard was fun to say. Even when I was in kindergarten, Coquillard was fun to say. We were the Coquillard Comets, and we learned a little bit about him in elementary school as part of local history, and because our school was named after him.
Yeah.
And we learned about him as the father of South Bend.
Okay.
It's pretty accurate.
Yeah.
He, more than anyone else, is the guy who took South Bend and turned it into an actual real city. What would become where we live now. So he was as American as they came at that time. I think he was like 5th generation American, just had a French name.
Wow. Born in the late 1700s too. That's
yeah. So his family had been,
here since the beginning,
long before the Revolution. And he was a trader, and he came here and set up a trading post, essentially. The trading post he set up was at the Riverview Cemetery, was the first trading post he set up.
Portage Road up there in that area?
Yeah, Portage Road, because when people would hunt for furs or go down south, and then they would take it back to Canada, they would come through that portage, every single one of them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so his decision to set up a trading post in South Bend is not any more prescient than setting up a gas station or a Starbucks at a busy intersection.
I got you.
Right.
He capitalized
Yeah.
off of the traffic.
That's where people were. And he even like wrote about like why he set it up there. And then the idea was simple. Like, it's easy to float things on a canoe.
Okay.
If you get to his trading post, you have to carry your stuff 4 miles to get on the Kankakee River.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or if you have more stuff than you want to carry, you can sell it to him. And he'll, for whatever he'll pay you.
I got you. Because you're almost stuck.
Yeah. If you've got more than
SOL.
you can carry, you don't have a choice.
You don't have a choice.
Meanwhile,
you're not calling anybody.
If you're coming back the other way empty-handed, this is your last chance. So you're going to buy stuff from him before you get on your boat and take it back. So
dude was entrepreneurial off the bat. Huh?
As American as they came.
That's right, though, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. And so he sets that up, ends up being really a founder of the town, is instrumental in getting South Bend to be the county seat of St. Joseph County.
Okay.
Has lots of ventures, business ventures, and the Kankakee Mill Race is his largest single business venture.
Woo, and we'll learn how that ended up.
Yeah.
You had written by 1835, he realized, though, that his fur trading ventures were decreasing a bit. Native Americans that he was doing business with, I mean, unfortunately, God, they might have, in the next few years, been forcibly removed. Trains were starting to get in the picture, rendering rivers less needed. So in the 1830s, you had written that, he's in his 30s and he had to kind of find something big and new and something to make more money. Before we get into that, could you imagine being in your 30s in the 1830s and you couldn't just go DoorDash or Uber?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, seriously, think of that.
Yeah, he had to start a new business. So essentially, his intersection was becoming a lot less busy. Right?
Yes.
I liken
That's
it
a way
to
put it.
when they built the bypass around Kokomo, and lots of gas stations inside of that just went under.
Yes.
Because you didn't go past them anymore. So that's what was happening for Coquillard. He needed a new business venture.
A new gig. And he thought big, huh?
He thought real big. So he looked at the Kankakee River, which flowed through a place near the corner of Mayflower and Sample.
That's what I was going to ask, because we hear all about the Kankakee Marsh, Kankakee River, and it's since been drained and completely done.
Yeah.
So that's about where the Kankakee River ended or started?
No, that was it started, a little further east of there, but the way that it bent, the portage route ran between Pinhook Park, at the Pinhook, to the nearest place into the Kankakee, which was at Mayflower and Sample.
I see.
7-Eleven there now.
I see.
And there's no river. It's been drained and completely rerouted. So he thought that if he could reroute the Kankakee River through South Bend, right, he would have a steady flow of water that he could exploit for mills and just water power everything. He put out ads in the paper looking for people who wanted to invest in his venture. He put ads in the paper for people who wanted to build mills and businesses
along the way and capitalize off that.
Yeah.
Lots of land he wanted to sell.
Yeah. Basically, if he was successful, downtown South Bend would have moved from where it is now
up to
be near this race.
Think of that. Think of how different the layout of our city would be if this venture would have been successful. We're talking about a 4-mile-long waterway. That definitely would have changed the way that the young city was developed. Wow. That's crazy. That's nuts. He literally wanted to redirect the flow of the Kankakee for the hydraulic energy and all that stuff. I mean, that's crazy. But he wasn't the first to propose it.
He was not the first to propose it.
But he was the first to just dive in and do it.
Yeah, so it had been talked about as an idea, the same way that like scientists can talk about like what it would take to go to Mars.
Right.
Like just because we can think of something doesn't necessarily mean it can be done. And I can't imagine going back to the 1800s with the tools that you had available to you then and being like, let's redirect the flow of a river with these shovels.
That's what I was going to talk about. I mean, it was quite crude. I mean, there was no giant bulldozers or anything. All hand, right? For the most part.
For the most part, hand, and then some donkeys and stuff. So there was some animal power, but like the path that he carved out, the path that made the most sense was the shortest path. Okay, obviously, of course, That's going to be the most economically feasible,
right?
But that went through the woods. So even if you had giant equipment, you can't get to the place without raising a forest. Yes. So they took shovels, they took donkeys and horses when they could. A lot of times it was too muddy. The donkeys and the horses wouldn't work. So it was just people looking to make money, breaking rocks, digging dirt, basically trying to dig a new riverbed through South Bend.
And they started at the St. Joe River, am I correct?
They started at the St. Joe River.
Where Leaper Park area? Is that?
Yeah, Marion Street. So a little south of Leaper Park. Not too much though.
And they started digging right there and dug west.
Yeah, they started digging there and they dug backwards.
Yeah.
Because that actually does make the most sense. If you start digging from the river,
the river's
the water's going to follow you. Absolutely. It's going to make everything a mess. So they start digging from there, and then they started digging around Beck's Lake as well. And they started building mills.
Even before water was rushing.
Before the water was rushing. That's how sure they were this was going to work. He had run an advertisement in the paper that said it was guaranteed to be the greatest source of hydroelectric power west of Rochester, New York.
That's what I'm looking at. Literally, I wrote that down. Yeah. It's unequal power, he said.
That's a weird benchmark.
Yes. You know? West of Rochester, New York.
But that meant something to people. And they jumped in.
Yeah. That's just crazy. And like you'd said, there were ads along the Kankakee Mill Race. I mean, before it was built. And it's just like you said, they were confident it was going to work.
Absolutely confident.
That is nuts. So his vision, and ended up coming through with it, not all the way, but it's supposed to build basically a ditch through the city. Talk to me about somewhat just the proposed route. Whereabouts are we talking?
So from Marion Street, you're basically cutting due west through downtown, you know.
It's nuts.
The hospital's there now. And then
at that time it was just wooded.
Yeah. Yeah. And then through what is now the near Northwest neighborhood.
Absolutely. Yes.
To Beck's Lake over kind of by LaSalle High School, Bendix area. And then there was a turn there. And then from there, if you can imagine, it's like south by southwest to Mayflower and Sample.
I got you. Literally a 4-mile ditch, a 4-mile canal through the city of South Bend. And we talked about how crude it was to build that ditch. But the canal actually got built all the way from St. Joe River to Beck's Lake.
To Beck's Lake, yeah. And from Beck's Lake to...
so they built it from Beck's Lake to the...
The whole thing got built. The entire ditch got built.
That is nuts. And I did an episode on Beck's Lake. The lake, I learned, it was one of my favorite episodes because the whole history of that lake is unbelievable. And then tie in the fact that there's a damn neighborhood there now. It's just, the whole story is unbelievable. And I interviewed Lynn Coleman. He was down here. And if you listen to any of these episodes, that one is wonderful. I always talk about how intertwined we all are in regards to our local history. Like I said there, if you haven't listened to the episode titled The Lake, I highly encourage you to do so. That whole area is steeped with local history. Because here Aaron and I are talking about the beautiful area of Beck's Lake in this episode in the 1830s. And then 100+ years later, local leader Lynn Coleman shared his memories of when the area was a dump. And the neighborhood that was built right next to it was one of the few in South Bend that African Americans could purchase homes at. And shout out to Lynn Coleman for passionately sharing his memories of growing up there. Again, shameless plug, go listen to that episode. Beck's Lake back before 1920s, before they tried to put sewers underneath there, it was a beautiful, beautiful watershed area.
Yeah.
And when I started reading in the book about Beck's Lake, I'm thinking, in my head, I know where this is going to go. When they drained the original Beck's Lake, they said it was the size of Hudson Lake. I've read in the newspaper. Now it's a drainage ditch. It's really just a retention pond.
Yeah.
But when they wanted to put sewers underneath there, they about a year or so into doing it, they had to scrap the whole project because everything was sinking down into the marshland. The land was not suitable to hold any pipes. It was not suitable for anything like that. So when I read that they had to go through that Beck's Lake area, I'm thinking, okay, it's not going to be easy, right?
Not at all.
So they built this whole thing, and you had to imagine, like you wrote, that Coquillard is there at the time, or when they had to try to the final shovel.
I have no evidence for it, but
you got to imagine.
Yeah, he had to be there for the grand moment when the last shovelful would be dug and the river would be manipulated and start racing. Yeah,
yes.
he was there.
What happened?
I'm certain of it. Nothing. Nothing happened. Not a trickle of water moved from one river to the other. Not a drop. And it's because the land around Beck's Lake was super sandy, super marshy. But it's also a watershed. It's a continental divide. If you're driving on 31 south of town, there's a sign that shows you it's the Continental Divide, which means that all the water that falls south of that line eventually goes to the Mississippi River.
Okay.
And down into the Gulf. And everything north of that line,
vice versa,
goes into the St. Joe and winds up in the Great Lakes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Coquillard wouldn't have known that at that time.
No, he did not know that.
Wow. What? I just can't imagine what was going through his head.
Well, he realized pretty quickly he was about to be broke.
Yeah, because he mortgaged everything.
He mortgaged everything. He took loans out against his own property.
Yeah.
He persuaded some of his friends to do it too. And they tried a few more things to try to force the water through. So he threw a little bit more money at it, but I think he knew in his heart at that point
it was done.
It was done. He just felt like he had to try.
God, you know how hard it is when you work on something, even trying to, change a stupid pipe on your sink, and you spend hours and hours, you're fixing it, and then you turn the water on and water still leaks. I couldn't imagine investing my whole life savings, inviting my buddies to invest in that, selling plots of land. And then for that I just couldn't imagine.
Yeah, it was
this is life devastating.
Just horrifying for himself, for dozens of people who'd invested, for people who'd built, people had built,
that's insane,
flour mills, sawmills,
insane.
Like they were ready to go, they just needed the water. And then he had to go back and say,
no water.
It's not happening.
That's just nuts, man. That is truly nuts. You mentioned that afterwards Coquillard did try a few different ventures here and there, and so did he and then we mentioned earlier he passed away younger, right?
Yeah.
What happened?
His race building days were not quite behind him. They went on to work to build the East Race, which is a race that worked. He put a flour mill there.
Okay.
Did some flour milling, milled some flour, and made a living for himself that way. But there was a fire at his flour mill, and he was on like an upstairs portion of it where it had burned. So this is a bad idea. And plank gave way, he fell and hit his head, and he died. And obviously now there's a park, there's a school.
Yeah.
But at the time, like, the flour mill never reopened because of the fire damage and him not being there to work on it. So at that point, the only thing that was really left of his legacy was
the ditch,
this empty ditch.
When I was reading the chapter, I was in my head, I'm thinking, the ditch was probably filled in, soon after or something. But even in the 1880s, 50 years later, damn near 50 years later, this dry ditch was still there, and you found articles that discussed an accumulation of trash in the ditch, and everything like that. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, so now there's
That's
a
crazy.
ditch running through the city,
That's
right?
nuts. 50 years later, 40 years later.
Yeah. And so
and the city's much more developed.
If the ditch did anything, it drained rainwater into the river.
Yeah.
So it may have been helpful for that, except it is like a big eyesore to have a ditch through your city. But then people start throwing trash in the ditch because I guess that's just what you do.
Right.
And so as trash gets into the ditch, it forms dams in the ditch. And as the rainwater piles up against this trash, it starts flooding people's yards.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I found was someone suing the city essentially to say, you got to fix this ditch. Every time it rains, it comes down to this pile of trash that someone threw in the ditch, and my yard floods, my house floods.
That is crazy.
So it was a pain in the butt for Coquillard, but for the next 50, 60, 70 years, like
for the city, it was
an eyesore and an annoyance and a hazard.
Yeah. God, I'd love to see pictures of it. There obviously aren't any, but I would love to see just to help me imagine this, because at first it would have had to been in the woods, but man, by the 1880s, there's some development, and we talk about development. And the main thing about this podcast is how intertwined our past is to our present, right? The land that was developed, the land right now that has some of our most cherished old homes on West Washington Street, the History Museum, the Copsha Home is there, the Tippy Canoe place. Alexis Coquillard owned that land.
Yeah, that was all the land that he owned.
He owned, and then he got foreclosed on.
That was what he put down as collateral when he borrowed money to build the race. So he lost it all.
Yeah.
And even if you look at the land deeds today for those properties on West Washington Street, they're listed as bank outlots.
Yeah.
Because the bank took them and then resold them.
That is nuts. Because when I was when I was researching, I did an episode on the block, the 1200 block of West Washington Street. And when you look in the old newspapers, when you keyword search West Washington or something, you get a lot of advertisements, a lot of just jargon in the newspaper, like public thing. And they talked about bank outlot, like back in the day. And so that's crazy. It's from Alexis Coquillard.
Yeah.
Because he owned that land.
He owned all of it. That was all of his land. And now all the houses that have like the names of famous people in South Bend's history are out there.
Yeah.
And none of them have his name on it.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. Then we talk about how our past is intertwined, with our present right now. Think of an alternative world if the race would have worked, okay? Let's say, man, they did that last shovel, water rushed down there in the 1830s, everything's built up, I'd imagine by 1900 it would have been obsolete, and then the city still would have been stuck with an eyesore, just like the original East Race was, just with the toxic eyesore for years,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. They would have built up along it. Like I said, downtown would have moved.
That's crazy.
Downtown would have moved to be on this canal, and maybe we'd have a canal district like Indianapolis has or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But they got none of that.
No.
They got a ditch.
Just a ditch. That's funny. All right. Anything else you think to add to it, or?
I think people ought to go see the bridge.
I think so.
It's in the city cemetery.
Yes.
About 2/3 of the way back. The city cemetery, like you said, is worth a tour all its own, just to look at the tombstones and see the names.
Yep.
But the bridge in the cemetery is the only thing left. So
At all.
At all. So obviously the ditch has at last been filled in.
Yes.
And the only remaining relic of Coquillard's Folly, the Kankakee Mill Race, is this one bridge in the city cemetery that connects nothing to nowhere and exists for no reason.
No.
Except to remind us of the greatest failure of our city's greatest father.
That's awesome. Well, that's not awesome he failed, but the whole story, everything, it's just so intriguing. So
yeah, it's great they saved it for us.
All right. Thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Round the Bend Now and Then. An extra special thanks to Aaron Hellman for once again joining us and sharing another piece of our local history. Again, folks, check out his website, aaronhellman.com, and purchase his books. You will not be disappointed. I also have his website in the show notes. Be sure to follow Round the Bend Now and Then on all of our socials and download, like, or subscribe on whatever podcast app you listen to us on. Please join us again next time as we learn more about South Bend and Mishawaka's Now and Then.